So, first of all, thank you all for coming. It's very flattering that everyone wants to attend this presentation. So, as you all know, I'm Nadia Elkady, and I'm here to present my thesis entitled Microbial Leather, the Feasibility of Bacterial Cellulose Composites as Alternative Biotextiles. And my supervisors were Professor Dr. Manuel Katza and Dr. Sandra Giegler. Thank you both. So let's start off with this quote from Aldo Leopold. "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." This quote resonates immensely with what we're going through in the world right now because of sustainability, global warming, increasing temperatures, everything that is disturbing the biotic community. So having that in mind, we must take into account or take a look into the sustainability or lack thereof of the textile and fashion industry. So the textile and fashion industry has a lot of negative effects on the environment. Some of the factors it affects are water pollution, water consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, microfibers in oceans, trash accumulation, and chemical additions. So for more context to the validity of why this research is necessary, let's look at some statistics. In terms of water pollution, 20% of industrial water pollution comes from textile treatments and dyes, as well as the fact that 22,000 liters of toxic wastes are dumped into rivers by tanneries every day in Bangladesh. Some of you who have already asked me, and I will answer this question now, asked me why Bangladesh, but this reflects on the ethical part of the textile and fast fashion and fashion industries in general, because Bangladesh has cheap labor and child labor, unfortunately, and things like that. So this is also something to reflect upon, as well as the fact that 200,000 tons of dyes are lost to effluents every year. In terms of water consumption, 2.6% of the global fresh water produced is used to produce cotton, and 1.5 trillion tons of water are used by the fashion industry every year. Meanwhile, 750 million people do not have access to drinking water. So juxtaposition-wise, you can see how big of an issue this is. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, 70 million barrels of oil are used per year just to produce polyester, and 10% of the global carbon emissions globally come from the apparel industry, which is not a small amount in any way, shape, or form. 400% more carbon emissions are produced if a garment is worn 5 times rather than 50, which is just a huge reflection on fast fashion in general. And due to fast fashion as well, microfibers or microplastic fibers specifically are released into the ocean. Around 190,000 tons of microplastic fibers go into the ocean per year, and twice as many fibers are released by old garments than new ones. And this will continue to happen due to the fact that 52% of our clothes are made from polyester. Concerning trash accumulation, the average lifetime of a garment is 3 years, which is basically nothing. So that explains why 5.2% of our landfills are comprised of textiles, as well as the fact that the equivalent of 1 garbage truck of textile is wasted every second. Chemical addition is also a huge thing that we need to take into consideration, because although cotton has this appeal to it because it's natural and it's organic and stuff like that, lots of water goes into producing it, and it uses 24% of the insecticides worldwide and 11% of the pesticides produced worldwide, as well as the fact that 20,000 people die of cancer and miscarriages due to the chemicals found on cotton, which amount to 23% of all of the chemicals produced worldwide. So this will take us to the textiles that we use on a daily basis. Everyone right now is wearing something that contains one of these materials, if not more. And they are the most popular and most common materials to use in the apparel industry because, well, we don't have an alternative. But it is growing more popular because there is a need and there is a demand for it to produce textiles that are more organic and more bio-friendly and more friendly to the environment in general. That's why people have started producing, excuse me, this is why people have started producing more organic textiles, such as orange fiber, for example, who take the waste products of oranges and make silk-like fabrics to create clothes out of. Deserto, who create cactus leather and then distribute it to manufacturers of shoes and handbags and stuff like that. And Pinatex, who also do the same, who created leather out of pineapple leaves. This is why it like segues us into bacterial cellulose. Bacterial cellulose is a very naturally abundant ingredient or material in nature. Cellulose is found in plants, it's found in by bacteria, and yeah, of course, as I've been saying. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. But yeah, bacterial cellulose. It's a byproduct of brewing kombucha tea, and it also can be produced in other methods under controlled environments and labs. And a specific strain of bacteria is used to feed off of nutrients and then create this pellicle, which, as you can see here, is floating at the top of the kombucha tea. This pellicle feeds on nutrients such as nitrogen and carbon, and weaves this very intricate and beautiful structure of cellulose that is a very interesting raw material that has a lot of potential. The way that it's made is as follows. So water is boiled to purify it, obviously, and tea is added and it's left to steep for 10 minutes. Then the sugar and apple cider vinegar are added, which are part of the nutrient base for this bacteria in order for it to feed. This solution is then left to cool. And after it has cooled, the brew is then placed into a container that is previously sterilized. And then a SCOBY is added. What is a SCOBY? A SCOBY is a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. And this culture then feeds on the nutrients and creates a pellicle at the top of the container, regardless of the size of the container. So you can have a container that's 5 by 5 centimeters, or you can have a container that's 5 by 5 meters, and it will grow according to the limits of the confined space that it's in the same amount of time, which is incredibly fascinating and very, very cool, in my opinion. The box is then covered with a small hole cut in it that is then covered with gauze. This is in order to prevent any contamination, which I have had to withstand during my experimentation phases. That was not fun. And then the container is covered with a dark fabric in order to prevent any photoreactions. After 21 days have passed, the pellicle is harvested and placed on a slab of wood for drying. And as you can see here, this is what a dry sheet of bacterial cellulose, or kombucha leather, if you would like to call it, looks like. It has many, many advantages that make it very appealing as a material to be used, such as the fact that it's very flexible, it's biodegradable, which is the best thing about it. It has a high surface area to mass ratio, very good tensile strength, and the CO2 emissions that emerge from this manufacturing process are virtually non-existent. However, just like anything does, it has disadvantages. And these disadvantages are also apparent in the image. As you can see, there are small circular indents here that are present due to the fact that the production of this cellulose material is an aerobic process. Therefore, air bubbles are produced, and this affects how the material grows after a while. And it is incredibly hydrophilic, meaning that it cannot come in contact with water, or else it will absorb it and swell up, which is a main area of interest for me about this. However, it is still tricky to make it waterproof 100%. Also, it has a limited thickness that is confined by the growth of the bacteria. So it basically only grows up until like 22 or like 20 to 30 millimeters in thickness while it's wet. And as you can see, the color is not the most aesthetically appealing thing in the world, as well as the fact that it is not homogeneous in texture and does not have a huge diversity in the texture that it provides. This brings me to the purpose of my research. So I aimed to create food waste composite bacterial cellulose materials that are more workable aesthetically, mechanically, haptically, to be able to create a viable alternative for the textile industry, whether it's just normal textiles or an alternative for leather in any case. The methods that I used to be able to achieve an outcome were in the form of several experimentation phases. Each phase had several steps, and all the results underwent testing, and the results were analyzed and iterations were made until a very a repeated process that maintained the same results was achieved, that provided the purpose of the thesis to be fulfilled, let's say. So phase one. Phase one was very fun because I got to do it as part of the Grundlagen Material and Technology with Professor Kretzer. It was comprised of 20 experiments in which the additives that I chose to use were mixed in the brew. So let's just focus on the additives for a second. Why food waste? Well, food waste is a huge issue in the world all around us. 1.3 billion tons, I think, are wasted every year, either due to food loss or food waste, as well as the fact that we all know that all like fruits, vegetables, they have their own material properties. They have their own physical properties that protect them and prevent them from decaying and allowing them to grow in nature under extreme circumstances. So it's only intuitive, and it only sort of makes sense that these additives could enhance the material itself in a composite material. So the students were all assigned an experiment. They were either given a natural dye, a food waste powder, or both, and they were asked to mix these ingredients in with the brew in the hopes that these additives would adhere to the bacterial cellulose pellicle and or grow around it, therefore having the additives embedded in the cellulose. So this slide here shows the experiments as well as some of the examples. Here you can see that there are dyes made out of several organic ingredients, as well as powders that were made from food waste that I collected from my own home and from neighbors and friends all around. Thanks, guys, by the way. And the green and black dots indicate whether the experiment was conducted with green tea or black tea. The growth was very, very closely supervised, and it was documented. And this slide here represents what the kombucha leather looked like after 1 week of growth. However, there was a slight problem of contamination, but it was resolved. And after 21 days had passed, a harvest was done. And as you can see here, it is very obvious that the materials are not homogeneous. Although some dyes worked, specifically the red cabbage, beetroot, and curcuma, some others didn't, such as the spinach and the blue dye, which was made out of the red cabbage mixed with baking soda. There is a very obvious lack of homogeneity. There are holes, there are some of them warped, some of them shrunk, and the one at the top was burnt because it was attempted to be dried in an oven, and that was not successful, but we learn. So after the harvest, probes were made out of these materials, and they were tested using a universal testing machine, and the results were analyzed. This graph here represents these results. Unfortunately, the probes were not all successful. Not all of them indicated results or recorded results in the machine. However, the ones that did give results that contained powdered additives showed that where the additives adhered to the pellicle, the strength did increase, which gave a very optimistic approach to the hypothesis. So in conclusion of phase one, the adherence of additives did prove to increase strength, but the lack of homogeneity caused weakness in some places. And as we all know, an object is only as strong as its weakest point. Yes, it's a cliche for a reason. And the materials are not yet workable due to the limited thickness. During this phase, I also tried to delve into waterproofing the material with the help of the internet and other designers and other material experimenters. a recipe was found that comprised of beeswax, turpentine, and linseed oil or linen oil, um, which abided by the restrictions that I put for myself for this lacquer that would hopefully make the material waterproof, which were the fact that it also needed to be biodegradable and it needed to be absorbed by the material. So the ingredients were mixed together in a water bath, and after that they were coated, the materials were coated with this lacquer, and they were tested slightly with water droplets, you know, just to test the waters, if you would allow me to joke. But it was relatively successful because preliminary water resistance was achieved. However, I would recommend that further testing be done in terms of this, because this is not the scientific test to test for water resistance. However, this was an entirely different field, so I decided to focus on achieving the composite material that was more workable and settle for water resistance at this point rather than complete waterproofing. So phase 2 was 12 experiments. And because there was no homogeneity, I decided to blend the dry bacterial cellulose in combination with glycerin as a binding agent in order to achieve a homogeneous aesthetic as well as a more workable material. The dry bacterial cellulose was blended and mixed with the glycerin and separated into a silicone mold along with the assigned additives. The additives that I chose for this phase were based on the most promising ones from phase 1, as well as the introduction of new additives in order to see and test the limits of how far bacterial cellulose could go as a medium for other additives that could aid in increasing the mechanical and physical properties or improving them somehow. After they were dried, they were collected and measured and tested for general like warping and shrinkage and things like this. And the results were very interesting. As you can see, it's very obvious that at least the color is more homogeneous, the thickness is more homogeneous, although some of them did tear and some of them did warp. It was a step in the right direction. The ones in the center are composites made out of carbon powder as well as thermochromic powder, as previously mentioned, to test the limits of bacterial cellulose. Although the strength tests did not yield results due to the fact that glycerin alone was not a good binding agent, they did the testing for the other fabrics, the other materials, the carbon and the thermochromic ones were very successful. As you can see here, a simple circuit was made with the one that was composited with carbon, and it is conductive, which is very promising for future developments, as well as the thermochromic one that changed color at temperatures higher than 32 degrees Celsius. So at the end of this phase, I thought, okay, so I need to find a better recipe to make the material hold itself better so that there's better material integrity. I needed to prevent warping and shrinkage. And although conductivity and thermochromic properties were achieved, I also needed to develop more the uses of it or the purpose of it. Is it even necessary at this point in time? But I did achieve color and additive homogeneity, which was a huge benefit during this phase. Phase 3 was mainly focused on optimizing the yield of the bacterial cellulose pellicle. This was due to the fact that the first batch only reached a very limited thickness, like in phase 1. So I thought, okay, so if I'm gonna use bacterial cellulose as a raw material, I need to produce a lot of it. So how will I optimize that? So 16 experiments were made. The main focus was to test the effectiveness of green tea versus black tea, the necessity of using apple cider vinegar, the sugar concentration, because, well, we don't want to waste ingredients, and monitoring the pH. And these experiments were all tailored based on information that was gathered from literature. And these were the results of the 16 experiments. As you can see, even though all of the the ingredients were the same. The ratios did really affect the growth of the pellicle. So some of them were very, very thin, barely even growing anything, and some of them were thicker. So that led me to this conclusion, which was that this recipe in this situation under these circumstances grows a pellicle that is the thickest and healthiest. And that is also apparent in the surface structure, that there aren't many like irregularities in the surface due to the growth of air bubbles. And this one had grown to 22 millimeters, which was a very good achievement at this point. Phase 4 was based on all the 3 phases that previously happened, and it was mainly an iteration of phase 2, the blending. So I needed to find, as I mentioned previously, a recipe that would bind the blended bacterial cellulose pulp together along with the additives in order to make it have the physical and mechanical properties that would allow it to be workable and viable for the textile industry. So material samples were made. There was, of course, a control group as well as onion peel group, tomato plant leaf group, potato peel group, orange peel group, and eggshell group. And after these samples were made, probes were also made out of them, and they were taken to the universal testing machine, obviously under the same settings that were used to test in the previous phases as well. And here you can see the results. The mean tensile strength of the control group was significantly lower than that of the composite materials, specifically the eggshell group. It's almost double the strength of the control group. As well as here in this box and whiskers chart, you can see that the control group mean is a lot lower, even taking into consideration the standard deviation of the maximum and the minimum strengths that it could achieve. But the other composite materials all have higher averages and higher maximums and minimums. Yeah, actually, with the help of a statistician and my dear, dear father, the significant difference between the strengths of these materials were assessed. So it was apparent after conducting a one-way ANOVA test with a sensitivity threshold of 5% that there is a significant difference between the control group and the other groups. And then for further even detailed information about these materials, a post hoc LSD test was performed also with a sensitivity threshold of 5% in order to compare between the groups to figure out the significant difference between them. And it was found that between the control group and all the other groups, there was a significant difference, except for the potato peel group, which was very interesting in my opinion. Here in this table, you can see common textiles as well as the composite materials, the control group, and self-grown bacterial cellulose. This number was gathered from literature based on a scholar that had used the same exact method for growth that I have. So this places just grown bacterial cellulose below the composite materials in terms of strength because they are in ascending order. However, the composite materials still maintain a higher tensile strength than leather, even though if we can look at the blended bacterial cellulose, we see that in comparison to the not blended one, it is a little bit, just a little bit weaker. However, adding the additives did make it regain its strength. So at this point, the null hypothesis was rejected and my hypothesis was accepted due to the fact that the food waste additives did increase the material properties of the blended bacterial cellulose. Then it was off to the design process, which was really, really fun. Due to the fact that my education did not cover fashion design, I also felt like this is something that I wanted to delve in because I like knowing things. And I thought I would tackle the fashion design industry. So I looked for inspiration in several Egyptian designers, such as Myrna Rodi, as well as Muhannad Kojak, and fast fashion brands like Zara and high-end brands like Alexander McQueen. And then I proceeded to sketch with my amazing sketching abilities, accessories and like bottoms and tops, because I wanted to create one of each. And after asking people and conducting interviews to figure out whether these are like following the fashion trends that they would wear, like people nowadays and the target group that I am aiming for, I settled for the bustier, the skirt, and the harness. And then it was off to assigning materials. The materials were assigned based on the mechanical demand and the position of the piece itself. So with the help of more experienced sewers, the patterns were created for the pieces, and based on their placement, the materials were assigned. So orange peels were used for the pieces in the back. This was due to the high mechanical demand and the fact that it doesn't need to curve immensely. Tomato tree or tomato plant leaves were used for the side pieces in order to take the form of the body. And for the front, I opted for onion peel composite in order for it to maintain its form, but not be too stiff along the body. And the colors that were assigned to each garment were based off of the Pantone, wait, I know this, the Pantone 2020-2021 autumn winter palette for the New York Fashion Week. Yes, I managed to say that without forgetting it. For the skirt, this was a bit tricky because I wanted the skirt to maintain its form, but I also wanted it to be flowy and fun and young and hip and all of these adjectives that describe youth people. So I chose onion peels and yellow, yay. But because the onion peels make the material a bit stiffer, I decided to create two different materials with the same additive, however, in different ratios. So the reduced amount of onion peels allowed for a flow, and the increased amount of onion peels allowed for the form. And because they are made out of panels, the skirt is made out of panels, alternating between the composite materials allowed for form and aesthetics, and as well as the color change that you will see in the pictures that are coming. And for the harness was sort of a little bit inspired by like breastplates, which were generally made out of metal. So this was easy to choose. I chose the eggshells because they're the strongest, the eggshell composite because it's the strongest of all of the other ones, for the part that goes across the chest, and the potato peel composite for the part that goes around the waist in order for it to take the form of the body. Then it was off to making the material. This was highly enjoyable. The pellicles were harvested and they were washed, they were cut up, they were weighed, mixed with my secret ingredients that allowed it to bind, even though they're not so secret, but it's okay. And the mold was prepared and covered with beeswax as a separating medium. This was particularly interesting because I realized that I could skip a step of making it water resistant by already making the mold have the beeswax as a separating medium. So the part that is on the body is already water resistant. And then the mold was separated into pieces based on the pattern. And then the pulp was added to the mold and flattened out in order to make it homogeneous. Yes, this is more homogeneity, as you can see. Then it was placed in a drying cabinet. This was a godsend, in my opinion, because in order for these to dry, they would have taken around 2 weeks. But the drying cabinet allowed for the materials to dry in just 24 hours, which is great because if these materials were to be produced on a mass production scale, this would be very efficient. The temperatures of the drying cabinet did not exceed 45 degrees Celsius, and there was very, very adequate airflow. I made sure of it. So that was awesome. And I got all of these amazing materials. You can see that the core ingredient is bacterial cellulose, but the additives completely change the appearance of the material as well as the texture and you get a huge variety based on what you need just by using the bacterial cellulose as raw material. And then it was off to sewing. Sewing did prove to be a bit difficult due to the fact that one, I don't know how to sew. Two, I had to learn how to sew in a day. And three, the beeswax that I used as a separating medium did cause a problem with the sewing machine when the wax got caught on the foot of the sewing machine, which is something that I learned. So at least there's that. But a combination of hand sewing, machine sewing, and fabric gluing using natural ingredients, of course, was used to create garments. And here they are. Isn't that great, guys? Look at that. So if you can see in the screenshot or like in the slide, the close-up image, the material very easily takes the form of the body. It's incredibly malleable and it's incredibly resilient in order to be able to withstand the pins, I think they're called, that allow the material to take the shape, as well as here you can see machine sewing, which is applicable in this case, increasing it and its added and its advantages as a material, as well as the fact that it really does not need any seam treatment, which reduces the steps of manufacturing. Also looks pretty cool in my opinion. The skirt, you can see the alternating panels. The seams also, the hem, sorry, did not also need any treatment. This was made using a combination of fabric gluing and hand sewing. And the material is 100% ironable and it does not need to be washed because it can just be wiped down, which is very good for the environment because then no microplastic fibers would be released into the ocean, which is great. And the harness. Yeah, this was also very fun to make and it was easy to hand sew. There were no problems there. The materials were very, I want to say, cooperative. I think that's the right word. They wanted to become this. So that was very nice in my opinion. And these garments that you saw, they're all biodegradable. They're actually also edible given the right additives and your like keenness on eating onion peels. But yeah, they can be edible and they're biodegradable. They will live forever until you decide that you don't want them. And once they're placed in an environment where they can biodegrade, which is soil, it'll take between, I think, no, not I think, I know, between 30 to 60 days to biodegrade and it's gone. So no trash in landfills, which is pretty awesome. My recommendations for the future are waterproofing, because yes, let's make it waterproof, hopefully with like some genetic engineering sort of thing. I would also aim at achieving composite results without blending, just due to the fact that cellulose has a very interesting molecular structure and it would benefit it. The strength would increase, even though it is workable at the moment. The strength would increase, but this would require a lot further research in order to sort of composite the materials without blending them. And also examining other mechanical properties using Young's modulus or other things like that to just assess the flexibility of it and making it market ready in order to be viable for people to use in making whatever they want. Yeah, and just for the theme of circular design, let's go back to the very first slide and ask you guys if you have any questions for me.